What's up, Geeks and Gamers? It's Odin coming back with a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw The Little Mermaid open to a decent number domestically, but a horrendous international number, putting this film at risk of not only not being able to make a lot of profit, but very likely to lose a lot of money, to be yet another Disney flop. That is where right now this film is tracking if the international numbers actually hold, and yes, it's not looking good. For this movie. Again, domestically, it's looking okay. It's definitely not the greatest numbers for a live-action Disney remake, and it's definitely not the best numbers for a Memorial Day weekend film either, but it's also not doing terribly in this market, and is definitely not flopping in the domestic marketplace. But it's the international numbers where we're starting to see a little bit of panic, especially from mainstream media, as Deadline is now trying to play cover for it, as it says right here. International bow of $68.3 million, which makes it an estimated $163.8 global debut. That's international and domestic together. The offshore launch is lower than hoped for coming into the frame, but it bears noting that there was something fishy going on in overseas markets with so-called review bombing in such areas as France, Korea, Germany, and beyond. So there you go, everybody. They're already starting to roll out the excuses as to why the film's international numbers have been so bad. They're claiming it's review bombing. It's amazing that they will only ever call out review bombing, so-called, if a film is getting negative press, right? But when it comes to films that get, random 5-star ratings, random 10-star ratings, whatever the scale might be, you don't hear nearly as much about those, right? Is that not also review bombing? If you have a plethora of people putting artificially high numbers, or, hey, they liked a movie, but in all honesty, they wouldn't think a film was a 10, but they're going to give it anyway to try to offset so-called review bombing. Maybe it's rather that the film is just not all that good, right? And I've been, I think, one of the more positive persons about the movie as far as the overall tone. If you look at my review over on my channel, you'll notice that, again, this film is not good. I gave it a C-. However, I did also say there's a couple things in here that are worth noting. I think that the voices of the people who are singing is pretty good. I think also that some of the CGI, though vastly overused, vastly overplayed, and therefore looking really bad, also does not look nearly as bad as it could have been, especially some of the underwater sequences, but doesn't make up for the fact that the story is awful. The story is terrible. The changes that they've made were clearly done for agenda-driven narratives, and instead, it's given us a film that ultimately no one was asking for, right? And that's where it was from the very beginning. Maybe it's also people are just tired of having classic animated films being remade into live-action films with no soul, with no heart, and really the question then left is, well, why are you making this movie? And all we're left with are to draw conclusions that are pretty much on the surface, as it were. But anyway, $164 million global opening for this movie, and they are already blaming the incredibly terrible, the incredibly bad international numbers for this movie on so-called review bombing. Looking at the numbers, though, according to the domestic total so far for this weekend, Little Mermaid at $95.5 million. Now, what is interesting is that means that this movie is really not holding up even to another film that came out from the live-action universe back about 2019, which was the film Aladdin. That film actually is going to be the best comparison for this movie going forward, right? So worldwide, we have $163.8 million. The reason why Aladdin is going to be the best comparison is because that film had a very similar release schedule as far as when it was released, right? So coming out over the Memorial Day weekend. And if we go ahead and just compare these two movies, first off, Aladdin cost a lot less money, right? When you even adjust that numbers for inflation, you'll see that the number is still a lot lower than what it is for Little Mermaid. The domestic opening weekend, though, the 3-day opening for Aladdin was $104.3 million when you actually adjust those numbers. So that means Little Mermaid right now is tracking behind where Aladdin was. They're also projecting that the film is going to come in around, $120 million or so through Monday. Well, then that would put also this movie behind the $133 million that this film, that Aladdin, had made over the same Memorial Day frame. So, as I said, the film itself is not doing terribly, right, because it is still up there with Aladdin, right? It's tracking behind, but it is still there. And when you take into account that this film is expected to have about the 5th highest grossing opening weekend for Memorial Day, again, I always like to remind people that those are the unadjusted numbers, and hopefully you can understand why that's such an important factor to put into this, right? Is because, yes, if you're comparing this film to a movie that came out 20, 30 years ago, when the value of the dollar was very, very different, not really a very fair comparison, right? Ultimately, what this means is Little Mermaid, it's doing okay domestically, but internationally, it is just not doing anything really at all. If you look at the entire international run for Aladdin, it made $788 million. You don't look at this $68.3 million from the international right now so far coming from Little Mermaid, and you can't possibly logically look at that and say, okay, yeah, this film is absolutely going to get close to Aladdin or is going to do the same numbers as Aladdin. It's just not going to happen based off of just mathematic possibility at this point, right? They would basically have to. Actually, no, I'm gonna scratch that. There would have to. The only way that it would possibly change is if there were a plethora of countries the movie has not opened in yet, and therefore that is the reason why the film would not be doing well. But that's not what's going on here. The only major market that has not gotten this movie yet was Japan. And though Japan did do very well for some other live-action films, bring up here Aladdin for a second, just again as a form of and as a way of comparison, when it comes to the live action films in Japan, right, that itself is not necessarily a huge market for all the live actions. But when it comes to Aladdin, the film that we're comparing it to, $112.4 million unadjusted it made in that country. So some people might be saying, okay, yeah, but Japan, it came out very heavy for Aladdin. Maybe it'll do the same thing going on right now for Little Mermaid. Well, according to the Asian markets that we're getting in so far for this movie, it just does not seem likely to be the actual case. And so not doing very well, Little Mermaid internationally. And ultimately, I think that's going to lead to the film being most likely a box office flop, but I'll have the official numbers on that next weekend. Fast 10, I can say, is also not in a very good place right now either, right? So it's kind of like the reverse. Little Mermaid is doing pretty well domestically, right? Doing okay domestically, and then Fast 10 is doing abysmally, right? Not only did it have a very low opening weekend last weekend, it dropped 66% domestically, making $23 million, and almost lost to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Look at the difference between those two movies, right? Guardians is still having just a complete terror run on this, right? 38% drop in week 4. This movie has been hovering around the 40s and 50s every single week as far as its holds every week, dropping now into the 30s. Hey, that means people are going to see this movie over the holiday frame. That's very good news for Guardians. It's very good news for Disney in that regard. So while they have Little Mermaid, which is likely going to lose them quite a bit of money, hey, at least Guardians is making some profit for them in the long run. Coming in still in the top 5 is the Super Mario Brothers movie. This film is slowing down quite a bit, though, internationally, too, and so not likely going to add too much more to its overall totals, especially with the film now being available on PVOD, and not too long from now, imagining it'll be available on physical media. This film has pretty much run its course. And then rounding out the top 5 is The Machine, film I have no general interest in, but hey, I've heard some people say it's actually pretty funny. We looked at the numbers internationally for The Little Mermaid. Let's look at Fast 10. So as I said, it's a reverse situation going on for Fast 10, right? Whereas Fast 10 is actually doing pretty well internationally, $399.3 million. Domestically, it's not doing much of anything. This movie would be lucky to get to $150 to $200 million domestically. And I don't think that internationally it's going to be able to perform to such a degree to make up for the losses that it's seeing domestically. And so ultimately, Fast 10 is pretty much no longer having any chance or opportunity to make $1 billion. I didn't think it did in the initial run-up to this movie based on the early numbers and the early projections. But at this point, now that we actually have data in front of us, $1 billion seems very much out of play, because in order to do that, again, some films have been able to do that internationally in and of itself. But right now, with this film's tracking 2 weeks in, it's not tracking strong enough to think that it's going to get to $1 billion alone. And domestically, it's not holding up any of the weight whatsoever to think that's even a possibility at this point in time. Guardians, on the other hand, again, still not $1 billion, not looking at $1 billion anyway. But now at $731 million, again, film is doing very, very well. Again, according to the metrics that I use, this film has broken even. Again, my break even was around $625 million. I think some people had it as $700 million. If you use either of those, guess what? It's broken even, and it's adding profits, and it's continuing to move forward. This film is going to easily get to $800 million, and the question is going to be basically, where does it fall between the $800 and $900 million mark? I think it has a good chance of actually being able to do better than what Black Panther Wakanda Forever did, and ultimately it deserves to do so, right? Because Black Panther and now the film that it's going to easily pass up by next weekend, which is Thor: Love and Thunder, were both really bad movies. Were both terrible films. And while Guardians has a lot of issues in it, and I've talked about those before, it is definitely the best of the Marvel films since that of Infinity Wars, is where I go back as far as the last decent MCU movie in my mind. And so for them to be able to do this, hey, kudos to them for being able to actually pull off something that most of the MC films have not been able to do as of late. Super Mario Brothers movie has a good chance of getting to $1.3 billion, but it is slowing to a point where it's looking like that's probably going to be really the ceiling for this movie, is somewhere around $1.3 billion. 1.4 is pretty much off the table, I would say, at this point in time. And I go back to the numbers I was saying before. Some people were, again, for weeks and weeks and weeks saying, just wait until Japan. It's doing okay in Japan for a Western film. It's not doing anything, though, in comparison to any of the animes, any of the native releases over there. And so that just goes to show you, hey, just because it's Nintendo and just because it's a major character that the Japanese audience and the Japanese market might like, I think that the delayed release probably hurt this movie. And also, it also shows that a 1-to-1 ratio between people who are fans of the video game and those that watch movies is also still not the case. We've seen this with all video game adaptations where we've not seen that same personality, but ultimately it doesn't really need these numbers anyway because it was able to easily make $1 billion. And basically what we're seeing is that the reason that is the case is that it's done well in every single market, right? It has not done incredibly well in every single market, but it's done very well. And the drop-offs especially have been quite impressive. Looking at the box office charting, because I love to do box office charting here on Geeks and Gamers, The Machine at $4.9 million. Again, the budget on this movie means it's not a good start. Machine probably will end up being a flop this early on with this little money. It's not likely going to make that back up. About My Father is also looking to be in the same boat. No budget on Kandahar, the new film with Gerard Butler, but I would imagine it's similar to that of The Machine and About My Father, both of which were in the $30 million range or so. Let me see if I can get the budget up. Yeah, so $20 million for The Machine, $29.1 million for About My Father. So looking at those likely being flops. With The Little Mermaid opening weekend, right now it's around $276 million in the red. And because of those international numbers especially not showing up to play, and those are going to be the numbers that most Disney films in general rely heavily upon, the fact that the domestic market is not overcompensating for that means that I would not be surprised if by next weekend when we do our box office breakdown for what the projections are on this movie, we could be talking about a around $100 million loss, maybe somewhere between a $50 and $100 million loss. And so we'll talk about that next week when we actually get those numbers, but not a very good start for this movie. Fast 10, again, it's a mixed bag because internationally it's doing well or it's doing okay. Domestically, it's doing horrifically. Right now, it's at $285 million in the red. And my projections for this film now that we have 2 weeks of data is that it's either going to lose around $75 million or it can make as much as $100 million. And what does that actually look like in the total box office? That means I think the film is going to end somewhere between $724 and $1 billion. Now, $1 billion would mean it would have to double what it's made so far. Every market that we see this film in right now is not showing those kinds of legs, and so $1 billion is pretty much off the table. But based on typical historical standards, that means we're going to probably see the film somewhere between $724 and $850 million. I struggle to see how it's going to be able to get to that higher end of even that average number because of how poorly it's doing domestically and how it's not really rocking anyone's socks off internationally, but still early in the international market, so we'll wait and see. But because of the domestic market, I can say the film's chances of getting to $1 billion are pretty much none at this point in time. But those are the big films and their releases and their numbers currently at this point in time. What are y'all's thoughts about these things? Let us know in the comment section down below. Also, if you want a fuller box office breakdown, check me out over at OMB Reviews, where I'll do the top 10 movies and go into some more initial data and some more comparisons as well. Make sure you smash the like button, whatever you're watching. Smash it. Whatever it is. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. A blessed Pentecost. And as always, God bless.